Hey guys, Coffee here. I'm continuing looking at CoffeeCalcs. So last time we went through and looked at the preflop shove math. Now I'm going to show you the next part of CoffeeCalcs. It starts doing some more advanced stuff. So this is the Postflop Equity Math section. So this lets you really examine postflop play and how ranges look postflop. And it has a number of different tools of doing this. So the first thing to do and notice is that there's two sections for preflop ranges. The idea is that this CoffeeCalcs will allow you to do range versus range situations. And so post-flop, you really want to be taking into account both your range and your opponent's range often into doing decisions. And so this is why we have two sections. So one would be sort of for hero and one would be for villain. And so you would put sort of pre-flop ranges on both players. So this is just some default that it's picked, and then this is probably okay. This is probably an okay flatting range, maybe. This is probably an okay min-raising range, for instance. So we'll assume that this is the min-raiser, this is the flatter. We'll say this is in position, out of position. You don't actually need to set any of that. It's just for your own sort of reference point. So a couple of things to quickly note when putting in these ranges. You can see down at the bottom, again, there's a little load section. This lets you load ranges. So I have some sort of preset already. I put some in already, but there's some that are already kind of preset in position, out of position. And then, same thing on this side. You can also, if you click on range output, you can also paste any ranges here. And you'll also be able to export ranges. I'll show you a little bit with that in a second. And so the idea is that, you put these kind of pre-flop ranges in, and then you put in a flop that you want to examine. So let's say we want to look at a 10-7-2 board with a flush draw on it. So I put in this board texture, and what it'll do is it'll take both of these ranges, and over here in the right section, the range partitioner, it'll partition these ranges into their little parts. So you can see how often each player hits different kinds of hands. So you can see how that the in-position player hits sort of a little bit more nuts, how often they hit over pairs, how often they have top pair, and you can compare it to how much hero has two pair, top pair, second pair, etc. All these kind of things. You see there's little check marks. I'll talk about that in a second, but first let me show you what else happens. So the other really, really crucial feature in this is that now once you have set up some ranges, you can then go ahead and visualize equity. Now for flop play, this takes a few seconds to initiate because it's calculating over all different turns and rivers and doing range versus range math. So there's quite a lot of math that it's doing. So you have to be a little patient. For turn and river situations, it's very, very quick. But for the flop ones, you have to be a little bit patient. And what this ends up giving us is an equity distribution chart. And there we go. And so how this works is on the left is sort of the amount of equity each hand has, and on the bottom is the sort of strength that is in your range. So at 0, you have the strongest hands in your range, and at the end, you have the weakest hands in your range. And so you can see how your different hands in your range stack up against your opponent's range. So here we can see that the red player, this is the in-position player, again, he's listed as villain. Again, the red's villain, green is hero. He is, you can see that his range is basically strictly stronger than his opponents. He hits this board harder. Every hand in his range has more equity than, than sort of its corresponding hand for out of position. So he's got, his nuts are stronger, he's got sort of more of them, he's got more sort of middle strength hands, he's got more sort of every sort of value hand. And he has a little bit less air, and even his air is worth slightly more. There's only a few hands at the very bottom that are sort of worth the same amount as opponent's air. So this gives you a really good idea of how ranges stack up, who's got more nuts. It's a great way of visualizing ranges and understanding, who's got a stronger range here, and in what way are they stronger. How polarized are ranges too. This will tell you a little bit about polarization. We'll see that a little bit more as we play out a hand and see how river ranges look. But it gives you this kind of sense of things. And so now the most important thing that you can start, and the other, I should mention another thing, while CoffeeCalcs is, mostly built for range versus range sort of thinking, you can switch it into hand versus range as well. And so if you click one of these into hand mode, it'll switch to doing hand versus range math. And so this is where I can look at villains, a hand versus villains range and think, okay, how strong on this texture is my, let's say I had something like 10-3 of hearts that I flatted pre-flop. How strong is this hand? This tells me my equity versus villains starting range, this entire range right now. And it also tells me, it also does a little bit of card removal. Well, sorry, I'll show you the card removal in a second. But it tells you just that kind of stuff. It gives you a little bit more about details, how many sort of better hands there are, worse hands, few things like that as well. And also what it lets you do is, you can see now that the button has now changed to visualize next street from equity visualization. Because you don't want to visualize one hand. There's no equity distribution with one hand versus a range. It's just an equity, essentially. But what we can do is we can visualize the next street. And this will turn this section over, and what this does is it lets you see how your hand stacks up against villain's range on the next street. This gives you a little graph of how, on what percent of turn cards give you how much equity. So, on less than 10% of turn cards will have a lot of equity. These are primarily when we spike 2-pair or trips. And then, on other cards that are, maybe not as bad for us. And so you can visualize, the very worst turns you can see actually for our hand are a jack, a king, or an ace. And they're all clubs. So clubs are kind of bad for us in general. But in particular versus villains, this weird min-raising range, the particularly bad ones are jack of clubs. Oh, that also hits straights. A king of clubs because he has lots of overcards, and the ace of clubs. And the queen of clubs is pretty bad. And so this is a nice little visualization of that. And it also, you can see down below, it also tells you about specific turn cards. You can just hover over the turn card without needing to look over here. And you can see, how much equity we have on different turn cards versus villain's range. And the red or green implies whether we improved or got worse. And it tells you sort of how much you improved or got worse. If we looked at a different hand, maybe something like, let's say we had a flush draw, 4-3 of clubs. We'll visualize next street. It's quite a bit more, obvious what's going on. And again, you can kind of see which cards are good, which cards are bad, and how good. So this is a little bit more obvious. These are the ones where we hit a flush. These are the ones where we hit a pair, and that improves us. And then these are the ones where we hit a straight draw. The 5, we hit a straight draw. We hit a gut shot. And then these are basically blanks, where we hit almost nothing. I think here we hit, yeah. So that'll, this is a really nice feature for looking at later street action and looking at how a specific hand will stay, on later streets. But now let's look at, one of the things that lets us do more range versus range math. So we go back to the range partitioner. This lets you not only sort of see the numbers, but it also lets you pick sort of sub-ranges. So let's say I'm trying to think about this in terms of like a poker hand. Let's say I think my opponent's c-better, and I'm just going to assume he c-bets everything in his range, just for simplicity. So I'm going to put in that, he's c-betting everything. So I make everything green. But let's say that hero, is going to play, again, just for simplicity, let's say our hero only calls or folds. We won't deal with check raising right now. You can do this, of course, on your own. Think about check raising range. But I'm interested in, hero's going to call or fold, and I want to see how his calling range stacks up. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pick, what kind of hands I think maybe we'd be calling. So I'll just pick, we'll call with pairs. We'll call with, 2 overcards. We'll call with our ace high. We'll call flush draws, open-enders, gut shots, and combo draws. And let's say we can even go ahead, if you're interested in specific hands, let's say we're interested in calling a some king highs. What you do is you right-click on the words king high, and that puts you into individual combo selection mode. So now I can pick out specific combos, like king 9, king 8. And you can see when I click on one of them, it flags it, that puts it through. If I click again, it actually puts an X, and it specifically removes that combo, so that's never in this range. That can come in handy with combo draws. And so let's say I want to have him continue with, strong king highs. But I can even go ahead and say, let's say I also want him to continue with king 6 with a king of clubs. I can right-click on this hand, king 6, and it'll load up all of these different hands, and I can go ahead and flag the combos I want. So this is the ones with the king of clubs. And I put the little back arrow, and you can see now it's sort of partially flagged. And that means that some of those combos are flagged. So I can do the same for these hands as well. So let's say we also want to float with the king of clubs, because it's a backdoor flush draw to the second nut flush. So we go ahead and accept that. Similarly, we can look at 2-card backdoor flush draws the same way, and say I want to continue with king high 2-card backdoor flush draws. So I'll click accept, and then I have my final range set. And so what this, now we can use this for is that next it tells us frequencies. So this is really useful if you're thinking about how your opponent would be flatting on this texture. It tells you how much fold equity you have. So if you're playing against this player, and this is his calling range, you can see immediately that he's continuing with 70.9% of hands. Right now, here the number will pop up. This is what these numbers are. And so now you know that his range has, he's not folding that much. He's only folding 30% of the time. Next thing you can do is go ahead and click on this, and it'll turn green, and now that sub-range is selected. Now when you look at things, let's say we want to look at hand versus range, and we want to look at the C-better, and we want to think, well, how strong is his 10-3 now? You'll find that, your equity now is versus this sub-range, versus this range where he's folding his pure air in a sense. Similarly, if I use the equity distribution visualizer, this will visualize my, the villain's c-betting range versus this flatting range. And so we'll get an idea of sort of how the flatting range looks versus the c-betting range at the end of action. Now, obviously, this is before cards come, and, there are a lot of, equity distribution graphs are very useful in that they give you a picture. But notice that sometimes this picture isn't 100% accurate, just to keep in the back of your mind. And by that, I mean equities aren't 100% accurate. Like, different hands can have the same amount of equity, but have different playability. In particular, draws tend to be much more playable than their equity. And so if we look here at Hero's range, the bottom hands are this 8-6, and they're gut shots. But they're actually play much better than their sort of equity suggests. They're actually probably not the weakest hands in our range. The weakest hands in our range are probably some of these like Queen-Jack, these like sort of raw overcards, or something like the King of Clubs, 5 of Clubs, some of these other hands. The gut shots are actually much more playable than that. But you can sort of see now, how strong, how much we're calling, how much equity the bottom hands have. So you can see how good, of a call in some sense King of Clubs was very quickly. We put in our range and we think, oh, we only have 34% equity. Maybe that was a little bit of a light call on the flop. Maybe not, because we have a backdoor flush draw. We can see how good, other hands are on this texture, and we can see, some of these other kind of equities. How good was King 9? Again, maybe slightly on the weak side, but not bad. And how good Ace High was. All your different hands, you can sort of see how they stack up versus villain's range. And so that's really useful. And furthermore, once you have it selected in green, it'll sort of remember this for the next street. So what I can now do is I can look at how things change on a certain turn card. So let's say the King of Spades comes on the turn. I can now, again, it's red right now, so this will be starting range. So I can immediately now see how things went from, the point where we called to when the King of Spades comes. Is this a good card for me? And we can see that it's probably a pretty good card. We improved quite a bit. We can see that actually now ranges, after we call and the King of Spades comes, our hero is now probably slightly in the lead in some sense. He's got a similar amount of nuts, similar amount of medium strength hands, similar amount of these kind of hands, a little bit more of these pairs of tens, weak pairs of tens from the ranges I gave. So a little bit more pair heavy in general. And then he has his air, for his bottom of his range is much stronger as well. He doesn't have any complete air, which villain does in this case. So now we can see that actually hero is slightly ahead of villain's range. So it was a pretty good turn card. And we can go through and do the same kind of analysis. We can say, okay, let's say villain is now betting, pretty polarized. And he's betting sort of, pocket jacks plus, and pairs of tens. So he's betting sort of pairs of tens plus, and then he's just betting some draws. Let's say his gut shots and his combo draws. So that'll be his betting range. And you can see, again, how often he's betting. He would be betting 62% of the time. And then we can, again, have hero continue. And so, let's have him continue with second pair, flush draws, open-enders. That's a pretty good range. Combo draws, of course. And so we'd be continuing with 58% of hands. We can click the green button. Again, visualize equity. See again how things stack up once we have a c-betting and a calling range. Again, we can always look at individual sort of hand versus range math. So versus villain c-betting range, how much equity does an open-ender have? We can look at that and think, oh, it's got 24% equity. And we know that. And we can then visualize the next street and see how often we're hitting our nuts. So while we have 24% equity, we hit the nuts, it looks like slightly less than 20% of the time. This is where we hit pairs of 8s. So it looks like we're hitting somewhere around 15% of the time. And so, yeah, this equity is popping up. So right around 15% of the time that we're hit our open-ender. And so, maybe it's not such a bad, our equity maybe is low, but since we hit the nuts 15% of the time, depending on how profitable you think the nuts are, it might still be, a correct call, depending on the odds you're getting. And so sometimes, looking at this graph might be more useful than looking at direct equity because, maybe 15% of the time we hit the nuts and we think the nuts is worth somewhere around twice the pot on average, which is usually a pretty decent equity, decent, amount of the pot you'll expect to win on average when you hit the nuts, when your opponent's pretty polarized and you have sort of a trapping hand. And so, you do capture probably somewhere around 30% of the pot on the river, not even counting the times where you might hit some pairs of 8s and stuff. Pairs of 8s, pairs of 9s do improve your equity slightly. So you can think, oh, I'll be capturing maybe 30% of the pot. If your villain is betting half pot, that can certainly be enough equity to call with. Is a capture factor to call with, despite maybe not even having enough equity. So it's worth, looking at some of these later street play and thinking a little bit how much of the pot you think you'll win on each of these later street cards. And then if you sum up over that, you'll get a much better representation of how good of a call it is on the turn. Okay, so that's one of the, ideas behind using that thing. And again, using the sort of hand versus range mode. But let's say, you put in all this kind of stuff. Again, I've hit the green button to make it go to the river, and then, you can look at river play. And let's say the river is, I don't know, a 10 of spades. That's a kind of cool one. Again, you get the rid, you can visualize equity, now it's basically instant. You can immediately get all these kind of different distributions. Now, actually, equity is all that matters on the river, and so you can immediately see that hero has a small portion of nuts. He has a pretty big portion of sort of strong value that's not quite as strong as villain, has a pretty big portion of sort of middle cards, and a good amount of sort of weak air. And villain's sort of similar. He's got quite a lot of nuts, some middle cards, some air. So this is actually a pretty interesting river distribution. It's pretty symmetric, but it has these kind of lumps and bumps in it, or steps. It's actually a pretty interesting situation that you might want to analyze, and you can actually go ahead and once you have one of these situations, you can click range output and you can copy paste it into another place. Let's say, you built yourself a river solver using Will Tipton's second video pack. You can go ahead and plug it in by copy pasting. There's also other software on the market, like one program I really like is GTO Range Builder, which lets you do river GTO solutions. And I can copy paste this range and use it as my starting range in GTO Range Builder. So it's really, really useful to have that. And similarly, in all these spots, you can actually you can also paste in ranges as well. You have to be a little careful because it'll get rid of sort of all your work, but you can paste in ranges as well. But the really nice thing is that you can output and you can copy paste them. And again, just make sure you know whether you have the green mode or not. Once you have green mode, you output just the hands that are selected, all the modes that are selected. Once you have red mode, you select, it outputs everything. So here we just output everything. And it's worth noting again that there's some options on how you want to display your hands, which kind of mode you want for displaying, whether you want individual combos or not. And this bottom one will do board card removal. So this will do the card removal depending on board cards. So if you look, now I have it that, it's got all 9-4 suited. But in reality, it has it has 10-3 suited plus. But of course on this board you can't have 10 of spades, 3 of spades, because there's a 10 of spades on the board. So once I get rid of that board card removal checkbox, it'll remove those combos. And so if you hunted through this, you won't find 10 of spades, 3 of spades anymore. You can see there's 10 of hearts, 7 of spades, but you're not going to find 10 of spades. So again, that's just something to keep in mind for more advanced users. But, you know, it can come in handy, again, if you're inputting into another program. And so okay. The last couple, you know, convenience features, there's a way to hide cards. So I can hide the river card and do some stuff on the turn and then show it back, just so that you kind of remember which card it was that you were working with. It's pretty useful. That way it doesn't get rid of any of your math. So if you change a few things here, and then you show the river card, it'll still have the same filters set up on this specific river card, and it'll apply them in the same way. So that's a pretty useful thing. So you can hide both. Show. If you click on the top part, the turn a river, it actually gives you a random river, a random turn. This also gives you a random flop. So if you're looking to train yourself, you're looking to practice, you know, how different equities look, how often we hit boards, that's a really good trick, is just to click random flop, and it will do that. It'll randomize the board. And then all throughout this, whenever you have a setup, whenever, you know, you work through all these filters, you put in some c-betting range, you put some flatting range, you can save all of your different setups. And you can just go ahead and save them, put them somewhere, load them. And so it's another really great way to save your work, to make your work more meaningful, because you can always go back and load it up. When you get to similar spots that you're analyzing, you know, let's say you go back, you're analyzing some hands you played, and you find a spot, oh, that's really similar to the analysis I did on this other board. You can go back to that other board, make the small changes, and boom, you have your results. So it's a really, really useful way to, you know, manage your work better and save time, is save everything you have. You know, try to make folders and organize your stuff, and make sure to save as much as possible, because that'll really help you in later times. So that's this section. It's got all of this kind of, sort of, again, hand versus range and range versus range, math and visualization. It does this kind of range partitioning. And yeah, so that's the post-flop equity math section. Oh, and just as a quick note, because I didn't come up earlier, the mixed range features from the pre-flop also are available in post-flop mode. So when you are looking to visualize equity, you want to look at mixed ranges, you can do all of that as well. So if you think about a you know, an out-of-position range that will maybe sometimes contain aces and queens, and then occasionally be wider and have more wide hands, you can go ahead and put in, you know, mixed ranges. And all of the things will continue to work. So in particular, your partitioner will continue to work. Your visualize equity will also visualize the mixed range equity. Again, it's a little slow because it's in the flop section. But all of that will still work. So this is a great way to still be able to use mixed ranges and still be able to do equity visualization and all the kind of stuff that you still want it to do. And here you can see that there's some of our pocket pairs that I just put in. I think. Oh no, sorry, it'll be right here somewhere. I don't know. Oh, it's because it's, yeah, there's aces. So there's where, so aces, kings, all that will still be in your range. And it's correctly sort of identifies how often they're in the range, so it gives them sort of less space in the visualizer. It's all done correctly. And also one last feature I also forgot to mention is that if you have a range and you want to look at the inverted range. So let's say I'm looking at a range of, let's say I'm thinking about like, I don't know, something like a range like 2 pair, over a pair, top pair, like a really nutted range. If I click invert, I get the rest of the range. So I can invert to get, you know, the other side of the story. That can be very useful if you're thinking about, there's a couple of really good uses for that. So first off, if you put in a continuing range versus a c-bet, you can pick all the hands you think villain won't fold to a c-bet. You can then invert it to see their folding range, which is very useful to know how much equity share you fold out. So if you're folding out some range that looks like this, you can go ahead in hand mode and say, oh, how much equity share am I folding out when I bet ace 3? And, you know, you can see your equity versus their folding range. Oh, I had it done the wrong way, but same idea. So that's really useful to note that, you know, inverting the range, you need to click at green, of course, you know, can be used to do that. And as well, I forgot to mention earlier, too, in the hand mode, it does take into account card removal. So if you're looking at, you know, you have some sort of picked range out here, and you look at the 45%, if I change the hand, our fold equity might, the size of villain's range will change. So you can use that to take in to see how card removal effects change villains' ranges and stuff. So that can be very useful as well to know that it does do card removal effects. And so I think that's all the features that I forgot to mention earlier. So that'll give you the rest.